Okay, so for the next news segment this month that we were going to do, I wanted to touch on Poe in some way for quite a bit, and Vincent Price has always been one of my favorite actors, so it just kind of seemed like an obvious thing to touch on all these adaptations that he did, mostly with Roger Corman, and how that's just sort of a match made in heaven when you look at it, especially if you hear like Price's like audio readings and stuff like that of Poe. And it all just perfectly goes together, and just the idea, it's just a fun idea in general, the idea of the Poe adaptation in general from anybody, because the great thing about Poe is that with most of it being like short stories and poems, a lot of like his stories say so much in like so little time. So you get stuff that's like in there and established and iconic, and then there's also a lot of room for people to just kind of do whatever they want and analyze it or interpret it however they wish, or to build on the story or whatever it is. And that's going to be what happens a lot as we go on. Sometimes maybe not necessarily for the better, but still, it's always great to see somebody build off of something that's already great, coming from artists that are already also just experts at what they do. So that's going to be what we explore with this. And naturally, we're going to start with The Fall of the House of Usher. Before we go into the movie, I guess just to quickly touch on the story itself, there is a reason it's one of his most beloved and talked about and interpreted and analyzed and all that stuff, where it's just right at the start, just right away, it's this entrancing story that pulls you in with just like this sort of dreariness and this very, very vivid picture of like the house and the land, and the way it just sort of takes its time and just lets the dread wash over you the whole time. And it's when you look at like the house and the land description, when he says an utter depression of soul which I could compare to no earthly sensation, just that alone just sets you up for everything you're going to feel and beyond as it goes. Because this is a story that, like, escalates as it goes. And the fact that that's the starting point it is just really fantastic. And then when we meet the characters that we're seeing through the eyes of this narrator, which are really just, there's, like, the valet there, and there's, like, the doctor he passes. But for the most part, it's Usher and Madeline. And the fact that these characters are, like, ghosts in themselves, especially like just Usher's description and just how like thin and like dead like he is while he's still alive, and even just the way he describes his voice, there's just something so sort of otherworldly about it. And then the isolation where we're trapped in what's essentially like this one small world with these characters as they just kind of roam around, particularly Madeline, who's just kind of walking through the house like a ghost occasionally, in this very like spectral way. And I also love the little jumps in time where it's like it's hard to even like they say like, you know, days or weeks or whatever, but it's like it's hard to tell just how much time passes. And it sort of reminds me of like when you're dreaming and you kind of jump from dream to dream and things just kind of, your brain doesn't acknowledge the passage of time, and it's like that's kind of what it feels like with the way time passes in the house as the story goes. And then just the way it gets increasingly scarier as it goes. Scary almost seems like a mild description of what goes on here, where it's like you're like repeatedly confronted with like death and mortality and that whole feeling. And it's, I keep wanting to say otherworldly. It's also kind of underworldly, a little bit, all these feelings. And then the way it uses, like, other stories, like the Haunted Palace poem is in there, and then the Mad Tourist story, and it's like, the way, like, the sounds from the story bleed into life, and you've got, like, the storm raging in the background, and everything just comes to this really massive conclusion where just all of the fright comes in all at once. And eventually, as he's like leaving the house, and it like, you know, succumbs like into the tar and stuff like that, it's like it leaves you with this, I guess, melancholy feeling, which is really funny because melancholy is like the very first adjective used to describe the house, like at the very beginning of the story. So it's yeah. So like I said, the way he can take such like a simple, like you could tell that story in its basic beats in like 3 sentences, but the way he was able to just make that into this nightmare with the descriptions, and the depth of everything it's clear why this is like one of the, stone cold absolute quintessential Poe. When you think of him, this story will be one of the very first things that comes to mind. So when you look at the adaptation, starring Price, and this is, of course, this is one of the Corman ones, the first of many. It's interesting to look at its approach, because it is one where you kind of have to basically abandon pretty much most, if not all, of what you know and love about the story itself. But that's not necessarily completely taking away from it as a singular experience by itself. But it is like, it's if you're somebody that's really going in like just really enraptured by Poe and his story, it is best to sort of quite literally almost leave it at the door as you come in. But just say that, though, does do it a bit of disservice in regards to what it does when it does really capture that vibe, like just right away, like the opening moments. Because we were talking about the way he describes like the design of the house and the land and everything, and it's like, I can't imagine the intimidation of having to build that set or make that set and shoot that in a way that lives up to Poe's descriptions of what this house and this land are like. And the way we see at the beginning, like the scattered fog through like the twisted woods, and then it's like hell has basically already been through here and laid waste to everything, and these are just the remains, is what he comes across. And we do have a character that, this Winthrop character that I guess you could say is bland, but it also kind of feels like he's naturally bland, because it is like he is like a narrator. Like the whole purpose of him in the story to begin with is to be our eyes and ears, and that's pretty much it. So I never really held it too much against him that Winthrop is a bland character. Where I do think it does take one direction that I'm not sure about when it comes to this being an adaptation, is what's been done to the Madeline character, where now she's engaged to Winthrop, and that's why he's there, rather than Usher calling him there. And so, doing this complete change where she's like this love interest, and not, the specter that's just sort of moving around the halls and stuff like that. And it's like, in the story, she's basically more or less an afterthought, yet somehow also constantly looming. And that's just going to be an aspect that's just not in this one, because this is the approach we're taking, this sort of romance setup. And yeah, I don't know how I feel about that. But as far as like, and it's even like stuff like if you wanted to make her like still in this sort of ghostly way, where like maybe she looks sickly or something, or it's like it's clear that something's wrong, and it's like, because naturally this is, like a movie that was in the 60s. We were just the very early 60s, so we're coming right out of the 50s, which is like the most sanitized decade in movie history. And so things are still going to be a bit, obviously Corman was like doing his own thing throughout, his whole career, but here it does have that sort of Hollywoodized vibe where it's like when she says, "Soon I will die," like, "Look at me, do I look full of life?" And it's like, yeah, you kind of do. You look like an actress that's like really made up to look glamorous, but okay. And just the idea of making her like such a major character and so involved with Winthrop specifically is it. Another thing it'll be missing from the story is that isolation, where it felt like we were in one place with just Usher in the middle of the underworld, and with this ghost kind of coming in and out. And it's this ghost-like figure coming in and out. And so we're going to lose that, and we're also going to have, like, I would say a little bit of melodrama, particularly with the romance stuff. You could argue there's melodrama in the story, the original story, but it's definitely melodrama of a different kind, and of a darker kind. But, yeah, this one does feel like it was sort of, we have to make sure to sell it, so let's add this romance into it, which was the way to do things at that time in movies most of the time. But, however, we do have Vincent Price playing Roderick Usher, that while he's definitely not playing the Usher of the story, He certainly is still a casting choice that feels like it fits perfectly, and he does create a character here that like really made a big impact on his whole career as like being one of the horror icons. And so like there was stuff before this, but to my understanding it was this where people thought it was like this is when he really became like the Vincent Price that people know now. And so he is a much more sinister Usher. Like Usher had sinister qualities in the story, but it was kind of sinister in a bit of a different way, almost like he was unintentionally sinister in the story. At least that's the way I read it. But as it goes on, and it does seem like he does have that vibe of the mad hypochondriac from the story. But like I said, it does feel like there's another sinister layer here. Where like he is, panicking about the fact that 3/4 of the family have fallen into madness, and he's probably next, and she's probably next, and that whole thing. And it's like this idea of that he thinks the bloodline should die. And it's like the vibe I always got from the Usher of the story was that it was his fear that the bloodline would die, and it was like just the closing end of mortality is what was kind of driving him mad on top of everything else in the story. But here he's kind of pushing for things, and we learn that more and more as it goes. And there's sort of this antagonism to him. But like I said, we still get some amazing moments here, particularly in moments that you want from like Vincent Price as a performer and to do his Vincent Price thing in these incredible sets in a story like this. And that's the kind of thing that just as like a classic horror fan, you can just... That's the kind of thing we really, really want. Like, this is like a sort of model for what stories like this, after the fact, would sort of look at to... This is the goal. This is what we want to be when we're doing classic horror. And it's all here. And we even get stuff like the early supernatural signs that may or may not actually be supernatural. Like when the candle's moving that first time, but then it's just, a part of where the house is cracking. That one thing that's like the most significant detail of the house from the story. And then we've got the chandelier falling, and we've got the banister coming apart. And I do like that we see those individual things of it coming apart. When you think about the idea of the story and how the house is like the life of the whole Usher estate just crumbling and dying off. And like how he and the house are crumbling simultaneously. So it's like to actually see destruction of the house throughout the story. I also like the way they make it more present, the past Ushers. Because it is, you could say what really works about it in the story is that there's just like, it's set up how many past Ushers there were and what happened to them. And then that's just something that's not really explicit. And so it's like, it's one of those things that, once again, is just kind of looming over. So to kind of like dive more into the past Ushers, where we actually like go down and they're like, we see their tombs, so they're like physically here in the story, even if they're just bones at this point. And then we see these monstrous looking family portraits where it's like they look inhuman. And then there's the whole dream sequence where they're all there, and it's like, once again, we're talking like that classic feel that you want when you come back to movies like this of this era, and you hear them doing like that ghostly moaning, like something that would be considered cheesy now, but it's just like so classically horror. It's kind of still creepy in a way, to see them all there with the maniacal looks on their faces and just doing the age-old ghostly moaning that we've known about since we were kids. And that's like, when you see a ghost, that's the first sound you think of, is what you're hearing coming from the Ushers during this dream sequence. When it comes to when we do get to the crucial point in the story where Madeline seemingly dies, and so I do think it's really interesting the way the movie plays this, where we have the moment when he's at the door and he's calling out to her and he's banging on the door. The more he's pounding on the door, though, the more she doesn't seem to know he's there. Like, there's no acknowledgement that he's there. And then when we get this long scream where it's like she's falling, and it's like it sets up a whole picture before Winthrop goes through the door, and then when he gets into the room and through the door, she's laying on the bed like Sleeping Beauty, and it's like she's been there for a very long time, and there's like no signs of struggle whatsoever, and there's no signs that she was alive 5 seconds ago, and it's like she's like perfectly made up and put together. There's no marks on her or anything. And so it's like to play that up from that angle and add that mysterious quality to her supposed death. Because even after we know what we know, it's still this odd series of events that it looks like nothing was happening 5 seconds ago when clearly something was. So I really like that kind of puts it off kilter a little bit. Like I said, even when you know what's happening and you know that she's not dead yet, that's really fantastic. And then this scene where they like hold the funeral, because another moment that I kind of love in the story is just how dark and sinister it feels when they have to go down and entomb her, and just going through that process. There's just something so dark and eerie about it. And then here we have those moments when we go into a little bit of dark comedy territory, where it's like they're holding the funeral, and then we see like her fingers moving, and then he like comically closes it when he realizes that she's starting to show signs of life. Another one of those things that shows that like he's very much aware of what's happening here in this particular adaptation. Then that's when we get to the moment in the story when she's going to rise again, and that's kind of what we're waiting for throughout the movie. So when we hear her scream, and it's like that's kind of a new scary perspective where it's like we know that Madeline was entombed alive in the story, and then she comes back. But it's the great moment where we kind of see it while he's reading the mattress, and the sounds are starting to bleed in, and she's like coming back, but we can't see this. We just know that she's coming. We feel that she's coming, and we hear it. And so, to kind of reverse that, we put the terror from her perspective, because now we know that she's alive inside the tomb, and that's scary in itself, looking at it from her perspective. And then, instead of that ambiguity that's kind of in the story of how she rose, like a sort of ambiguity of like, is she still alive, or is she like a specter that's come back from the dead for him, or whatever it is. When you're taking the approach that she was entombed alive and then got out, I like that they do a reverse thing here, where instead of that where it's coming for them, or coming for him specifically, they go after her and they can't find her, and then there's just like emptiness where she was. And so that's kind of a fun way to do it also. And then as it ramps up and like his madness starts to take over, and yeah, it's a different take on it, but I do think it definitely is effective as like its own horror movie done in this specific style, and like I said, being of this particular era. That's pretty much how I feel about this adaptation, I think. So it's like I said, if you're looking at it from strictly an adaptation of the story and you love the story, it's gonna leave you craving some of those elements from the story for sure. But to look at it like as its own thing, and as this thing that Corman and Price and everybody was doing together, like I said, the magnificent sets and the way everything's shot, and that sort of, that grainy look that comes with the 60s, it just in general, like just everything is working as like a classic haunted house movie. And so I love it for being that as well. And we can still go back to the story whenever we wish, so it has that going for it also. But, yeah, I think this is pretty much where we can end this, so we are going to have more of these. I'm pretty much going in chronological order until we get to, our last video is going to have 3 movies on it that are based on poems. But these others, we're going to go through the ones that are based on short stories. So that'll be what this segment is, and we'll continue to do, the VHS stuff we're doing, and like the double feature stuff, and the straight-to-video stuff, and a franchise, and all that other stuff is all going to be sprinkled in this month. So we've got all of that to get to. We're just going to bring Stephen King stuff, of course. So all of that is what's coming. So until the next thing, I think that's it.